So this psychology that we talked about later, if we don't address it, we cannot use it then as a reserve for liberation struggle, which is the other side of the coin of that discussion. Drake emphasizes in 1958 that traditional or racial Pan-Africanism was superseded by continental Pan-Africanism, which sought to unite all Africans on the continent, thus passing the torch from the diaspora back to the motherland. Despite Jonathan Kozol's argument to the contrary, I believe that Africa's disparate people are entering another stage in the evolution of Pan-Africanism, which is the realization of its founders and its visionaries, hence the AU, its global definition. As Mazuri demonstrates this point in the last episode of The Africans titled Global Africa. We didn't talk about this, I swear to God, we didn't put this together, but I think our reference points are similar. Traditional or racial Pan-Africanism is primarily an historical and cultural response to the 19th century era of enslavement. And I don't think we can say this enough in terms of Africana studies. The only rational way to understand colonialism on the continent or enslavement in the diaspora is to study them simultaneously. We have too long studied them as separate events, and they're not separate events. As Prof mentioned, and I'll talk to you about the statistics in a minute, that during the era of enslavement, the workforce of Africa, and it, by the way, it went all the way over to Madagascar, so it wasn't just confined to the western side of the continent, it went all the way over to Madagascar. In fact, I have a colleague who has found descendants of Madagascar who were enslaved in Virginia. Just think about this. People went all the way around the Horn of Africa and brought people up the west coast of Africa and shipped them into Virginia. It's a very long story about that. But when we look at the enslavement of people in Africa, the destabilization in the African continent itself that began way before colonialism came, that it actually weakened the continent, made it more vulnerable for colonialism to actually penetrate inside. Because the other factor in terms of enslavement and the slave trade is that it eroded trust within the continent itself. And the continent is still reeling from that erosion of trust among its various neighbors. So this is all part of this idea of traditional or racial Pan-Africanism. It was born of resistance to cultural degradation and legal bondage. It sought to resurrect the dignity of Africa and her people and to challenge the scientific and intellectual racism that justified her subjugation. Although its proponents and thinkers envisioned the restoration of the African continent and its people as the cornerstone to its political and cultural ideology, traditional Pan-Africanism remained the offspring of the diaspora well into the 20th century. While not grossly apparent to 19th century continental Africans, from a Euro-Western perspective, l'enfant noir suffered primarily because he or she was of African descent, and secondarily because he or she was enslaved. And finally, the argument continued, he or she was enslaved, therefore, because he or she was an African. So what does that mean? That means when someone like me goes to the continent, and I'm in a debate, as I was with one of my colleagues, about issues of African feminism and African gender ideology, and I'm making cross-cultural comparisons, and the person says to me, I don't want your pain. This is an African woman talking to me, saying that because of the pain inflicted on African women in bondage in the United States, she does not want to embrace that as part of her legacy. And yet and still, as I retorted to her, our ancestors did not receive that pain because we were Americans. We were the victims of that pain because we were Africans. And that's what tied us together. So it is important for us to look at this in this larger context. The 1848 Dred Scott decision of the U.S. Supreme Court underscores that one's Africanness alone made one subject to enslavement. For diasporan Africans, consequently, the restoration of African humanity and the African continent had to be central to traditional or racial Pan-Africanism. As Martin Delany observed, if the Negro race, as slaves, can produce as an exotic in foreign climes to enrich white men who oppress them, they can, they must, they will, they shall produce it in an indigenous clime in their own loved native Africa to enrich themselves and regenerate the race. So this was part of this earlier belief. The Africans who were in the diaspora in the Caribbean and the United States, who in the 1800s made the trek to Africa and settled. Some of them did things we're not happy about. Others of them did great things like building schools and working against colonialism. As the African family was dispersed throughout the Western Hemisphere, the Yoruba in Brazil became Afro-Brazilians. The Yoruba in Cuba became Afro-Cuban. The Yoruba in North America became African-American. And so it was and remains. The same with the Wolof, the Sere, the Mende, the Fanti, the Igbo, and the Luandan. As the Yoruba, Mende, Akan, and Luandan found themselves locked in a system not their own, they withdrew from their unique cultural wellsprings to recreate African culture and cultural resistance to their collective oppression. This is what we were talking about earlier, what Prof. Radical was talking about earlier in Stuckey's book, where he says what became the African American is really the melting pot of these African cultures coming together. So when I get to Ghana as a student and I see women standing like this, I know exactly what it means. When I hear people sucking their teeth, I know exactly what it means. That's right. Because my grandmother used to say, "Don't you dare suck your teeth at me, girl." Right? Because it had meaning. So imagine my shock as a student in Ghana seeing behaviors that I recognized out of my own family background. Or going to Nigeria and hearing Yoruba language and feeling like I could understand it and actually beginning to study and to speak it because it felt so close to me. But it was because of not me, it was because of that syncretization of African cultures in the diaspora that create the pathways for these things and actually foment the basis for early Pan-Africanism. Culturally, Africa's diverse worldviews merge, they reemerge, and then they spread throughout the Western Hemisphere. And politically, African people in a multiplicity of new African world languages and cultures adapted the West to its will like a potter's clay and focused on reuniting the family. And we miss that. We really miss it. Even in hip-hop, which sometimes drives me crazy, but I force myself to listen, I can hear the attempts of people attempting to reshape and regrasp something that is all their own. Separated by historical time and geophysical space, Africa's external, quote, tribes unceasingly evoked her memory, consciously and unconsciously. In diverse expressions of cultural and political practice, the gulf of space and time remained bridged by common ancestry, worldviews, and global traumas. The African in the global diaspora forged a new identity through marriage, breeding, concubinage, which first and foremost blended Africa's ethnicities into a panacea of New World black cultures. The Pan-Africanist was literally born overseas. When she or he opened his or her eyes, they gazed back across the ocean, across the River Jordan, we hear it in the spirituals, toward the doors of no return. But they did cross and return variously in revolts, in diverse national and Creole languages, in song, in narrative, in political action, and to a lesser degree, but more significant, in immigration. Nonetheless, the creation of these new African ethnicities meant that their subsequent generations were locked in a battle for legitimacy, both in the new lands of their birth and the old lands of their ancestors. I think I'm going to skip over this section because of time. I want to skip over the section on the middle passage, not because it's not important, but I think you've heard quite a bit about it. And I think you understand what I mean when I talk about the middle passage? Okay. And understanding the middle passage, one thing I do want to say, that